And as a man, I can do only just one thing at the same time. So now I'm preoccupied with starting the live stream. Yep, that started. Okay. Well, from those who registered, welcome. Maybe otherwise will join. I will keep an eye on that. Welcome with this presentation done by Alina. This is provided to you by Poland in Build as part of the History Month in the Netherlands. Well, the language is English. As you might expect, Alina is Polish, not really a skilled master of the Dutch language, but very skilled in English. And I think that's a more common language a language you have more in common than Polish, probably, with the people listening. And so welcome. The presentation will be in English. The number of participants is rather small, approximately 10 plus registered. I see 4 joined. Welcome. That's why I said you can switch on your camera. You might switch on the microphone if you want to pose a question. We make it interactive. Why this presentation? Well, as Poland in Build, we like to present topics to the people in the Netherlands, or if it's in English, even abroad, but basically the Netherlands, that share a different light on the history or the culture of Poland. Well, one big part of history in Poland is, of course, the Second World War. And last year, when we took part in the History Month, we also had a couple of presentations also surrounding the Second World War. And when we were preparing this year's participation, I saw another presentation done by Alina, and she is very knowledgeable about Auschwitz. She did her MA about the first trainload of political prisoners. And well, I won't say she knows every prisoner by name, but it's close and it's personal history. So she's very knowledgeable. And then, as the theme of the History Month is let's get to work, I thought about, can we do something about the work situation in Auschwitz? Because it was also, of course, a labor camp. There was forced labor. And I asked Alina if she wanted to prepare a short presentation or presentation for this. We can have a discussion. She is working for Auschwitz Museum. She is working for the Pilecki Institute since 2 months now, or is it already 3? Time flies. 3, yeah. So very experienced, very knowledgeable. Yeah, I will say the floor is yours. And I see one person leaving, so we're still with 3. 2 more in the waiting room. I will join. Okay, Alina, it's yours.
Floor is all mine. So
Yep.
I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Bear with me one moment, because we all like pictures. Hans, you just need to enable me to screen share.
Of course, more. I thought I already did that, but then I had to check out.
And feel free to stick your hand, you can press the hand button. I'd rather keep this more interactive than me just talking all the time, because it can get a bit boring of just hearing the person talk non-stop. So feel free to ask questions, feel free to make comments. I love that kind of interaction. I've got a couple of questions for people before we actually do anything.
I made you co-host, so if it's okay, you can share your screen now.
Perfect. So let's work on the slideshow. So here we go. We'll start. So Auschwitz and human labor. So we're going to talk more about labor and what people did in Auschwitz physically, rather than the extermination process and rather than the concentration camp aspect of indirect extermination. So I'm going to ask the participants here very simple question. When did Germany invade Poland? And does anybody want to stick your hand up, the little hand button, if you've got it, if anybody knows the answer, because this is probably the easiest answer.
Especially for this audience, yeah.
Exactly.
I saw Jasper raise his hand before I pressed mine, so I will lower my hand.
Go for it, Jasper.
Go for it.
You can unmute yourself.
Oh, okay, he did it in text. It's answer C, according to Jasper.
Answer C, the first is perfect. Easy. That was an easy answer. Okay, we'll get past that one. Okay, so when did Auschwitz begin functioning?
Ooh.
When did it open? When did Auschwitz actually open its doors to the first transports? Anyone? Anyone want to take a stab at it?
Well, if I have to take a stab at it, but I wait for the audience.
Go on, Hans. Take a stab at it. Go on.
I would say C.
You are correct. 14th of June, 1940.
Yeah.
Very correct. Right, okay, we'll move on. So 14th June, 1940. Okay, so the first transport to Auschwitz were French, Poles, Jews, or Germans?
And to help the audience, I kind of give it away into the introduction.
See, you think you gave it away.
Oh, okay.
This is my trickiest. This is my trickiest of all trickiest questions, and I've actually stumped Polish listeners with this one too.
Okay. Okay. Well, anyone have a go at it? D? Question mark? Says Dagmar.
D.
Germans.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. I think it's because I said I stopped the Poles. The Poles actually arrived on the 14th of June. The first unofficial transport was on the 20th of May in 1940, and they were the first 30 Kapo, meaning the functionary prisoners, and they were Germans from Sachsenhausen. So it is actually Germans were the first transport, theoretically. So the first mass transport were Poles, and that was on the 14th of June 1940. So there you go, Germans. That's my trick question for everyone. So who was the first camp commandant? Anyone? This one's easy. Anyone? Hans? Go on, you should know this.
Yeah, well, that's by elimination, so to speak. I would go for Gerhard Palitz.
What?
No, sorry.
No, you're wrong. It's Rudolf Hess, number one,
Hess.
A.
Oh, I thought that was the trick one as to Rudolf Hess, which I know is not the camp commandant. Yeah.
There's Hess and Hess. So yeah. Two, and that's why that's another trick one in there too. Yeah. So Rudolf Hess. And what was Auschwitz? So is it a concentration camp? Is it a concentration and death camp? Is it a death camp? Or someone ridiculously once told me it was a prisoner of war camp? I've already eliminated one question there for people.
Yeah, that's eliminated one.
So does anyone know A, B, C, or D? Then this question here is out of curiosity for me to see how much people actually know about what Auschwitz was. So there is a wrong answer, but just anybody hit me with an answer. Anyone?
B? Question mark.
Oh, who was that? Who answered that?
That B? Was Dagmar.
Very good. B, it's a concentration and a death camp. It was it had two functions. So very good, because not a lot of people know that. And a lot of people can assume that it was just a death camp, but it wasn't. So good. I like that. Yeah. So it's concentration and death camp. The first official Jewish transport to Auschwitz? Fun dates for you. Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. It's indirect extermination between 1940 and 1942. Anyone? I'll give you the answer for that. 26th of March, 1942.
Okay, that early.
And it was 999 women from Slovakia. So, and when was Auschwitz liberated? Anyone for this one? I'll give you the answer, 27th of January, 1945. Okay, so let's start with me doing lots of talking now, because that's why you're here, to just listen to me talk. So I've decided I'm going to give you a bit of background information, because we need to talk about the role of concentration camps. And without understanding what they were for between 1933 and 1945, there's no point talking about labour at the end of the day. So these camps were all self-sufficient. The first camp is Dachau, which is in March 1933. And these camps are basically more or less self-sufficient. They have all the labor. This photo is actually of Sachsenhausen, and the prisoners here are building up the camp. I'm going to use Sachsenhausen as a very good example just in a moment. But at this point, prisoner labor is cheap and it's cost effective. And between 1933 and 1937, we're looking at predominantly political prisoners, criminals, asocials. But then the camp function starts to change in 38, sorry. And in 1938, Germany invades Czechoslovakia. So now we're starting to get foreign prisoners within the concentration camp system. So what are we going to do at this point? They're thinking, okay, so let's really make use of these people. So Sachsenhausen, I said, is going to be my example, because in late summer 1938, they build a brickwork factory. And that's where the prisoners went and worked. And they had other factories like leather and shoemaking and all sorts. And at the end of the day, Auschwitz is modeled on all of these concentration camps in the Third Reich. So politics start to come into play at this point, because, you know, you want to have the 1,000-year Reich, you know, we've got all of these amazing plans. So they start to build construction equipment, and they supply, the materials for building this 1,000-year Reich of these political buildings and everything else. So this is what the bottom line is at the moment. They're building constructions, things. So for example, gravel and like I said, the brickworks, and in Mattenhausen, they had the quarry, you know, and so was Flossenburg as well, near a quarry. So you've got all of these raw materials that they're pulling out. And Auschwitz does play a role in all of this, but we're going to get to that in a moment. So let's put this out and put Auschwitz into a slightly wider context, because when we start to all these building sort of materials, you've got the invasion of Germany, invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Okay, you have a mass influx of Soviet prisoners of war at this point. There's 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war overall sent to Auschwitz, and pretty much most of them died. There's about 90 odd left in 1945 in the last head count. So most of the 15,000 die, unfortunately, in Auschwitz. They go through absolute horrific treatment. But my point is, at this, we've got labor force, and that is what Auschwitz is lacking at that stage. And at that stage, they also have to start converting to military equipment, because so far, Operation Barbarossa, not going too well. They need the munitions, they need the guns, they need the weapons, they need all of this, planes, everything, vehicles, it all needs to be built. So we're going to backtrack again. Apologies, I don't mean to be backtracking a lot, but we're going to talk about the first period, because we are going to come back to exactly what I was talking about. I just wanted to give an overview of that part. So Auschwitz 1940 to 1942 is the period of the concentration camps. It's obviously from the whole time, but this is the darkest indirect extermination point. You have extermination through hunger, through disease, through work, and all of those things. And we're going to now go step to step on how we actually become this whole product of human slave labor, because Auschwitz is absolutely huge, with over 40 subcamps that end up, and thousands of prisoners who end up working in absolutely inhumane conditions. So I've mentioned Auschwitz is created on the 14th of June 1940. Why is it created in Auschwitz, where it is? Simple. Location, where you have the two rivers, it's quite isolated, and cost-saving effects. The buildings that you see on the left-hand side, a lot of them were standing, and it's built, so they don't really have to build it from the ground up. It's easy, it's simplistic. It was originally meant to be a transit camp, but the second the first transport arrive, it becomes a concentration camp. So the early period is for building the camp, and once the camp is complete and completely built, what are they really going to do? So Himmler makes a decision in November 1940 to start making the camp more self-sufficient, so opening up farms. And the really interesting, I'm going to come back to this point actually. At this point, most of the prisoners who have arrived between June and November 1940, they don't have shoes. These people are working with no shoes. And you can't imagine, I mean, if any of you have been to Poland, coming up to November, December, it starts to get cold, and it can get up to a minus 30 degrees in Poland. And imagine having to work outside barefoot. I personally myself can't imagine. I'm the biggest wuss when it comes to stepping even on something small. I can't imagine these people working without shoes and having to run and do all the other things. So at this point, 10,000 prisoners for Himmler in November is not enough. You know, we want to expand our I'm losing my language now in English, I'm thinking in Polish, the working system. Himmler wants now 30,000 people. Okay, so then the first foreign prisoners arrive literally a year later after the Poles. And then we have Soviet prisoners of war. So we're now upping the amount of people that are coming into Auschwitz, not just Poles, we've got Czechs, we've got Soviet prisoners of war. The extermination process of the Soviet prisoners of war is a completely different kettle of fish. I have on YouTube actually a program of me talking about the whole system and how we became with the gassings and everything. So if you just search my name on YouTube, you'll be able to find the whole presentation on there. So we're not going to talk about today.
And if I am correct, just to give a reference, the first experiments with gassing prisoners were actually, if I remember correctly, from Fairweather, were done, from Pilecki's book, were done on the Soviet prisoners, because they were in so big numbers. It was for the Germans a macabre necessity to keep the numbers in control. So, well,
they were supposed to be eliminated anyway. These people are supposed to be eliminated. They're commissars, they're communists, they're Jews. Oh, they don't deserve to live. It's a whole other different kettle of fish.
Yeah, but okay.
Go to the YouTube channel. I explain everything there. It's so much easier. So there's a problem now, because they're bringing in all these Soviet prisoners of war in autumn 1941. But Operation Barbarossa is not quite working out at this stage. So we're needing more people. We're not having an influx of Soviet prisoners of war because we still need to work. We need to build up this workforce. So that's when they start bringing in the Jewish force. I talk more about this in the other presentation, and there's no point. We're talking about labor at this stage. So if you go to that presentation, you'll be able to hear a lot more. Anyway, so building Auschwitz 1. I'm going to talk about Auschwitz 1 in the early days and the labor first. So Auschwitz 1, I've put up a map here, and you can see, so everything here in the middle that I'm pointing out at the beginning didn't exist. This didn't happen. There was no camp kitchen. There were no blocks here. It was all empty. All of these buildings, everything around, apart from obviously the crematoria, which was a munitions bunker before, all of these buildings didn't exist. So all you have are the blocks here on one side and the blocks here on the other. So how does Auschwitz turn into Auschwitz? So they end up building 8 new 2-story blocks, so which are the 4 here in the middle. They end up building 14 adapted blocks, which are all the ones on the outside, except for a certain few that were already. So block 24, when you walk in through the camp gates on the left-hand side, that was originally an original block. You can actually see, it's very interesting, when you walk around the camp, you can see the blocks that were extended upwards because the brickwork slightly changes and the windows slightly change. It's a very weird fact. Not a lot of people find that out. I find that really interesting. So when I first went there and found that out, I started hunting around and looking at all the blocks that were different. The weird historian. And then several new buildings, camp kitchens, Gestapo barracks, streets, admin building, and everything else were all built. So you've got all your new administration buildings. You've got the new administration building here. Okay, you have the Labour office, another Labour office that was built over the gravel pits after the Soviet prisoners of war worked to death. And a camp kitchen, you had adapted blocks in the middle. This camp still looked different when it was liberated. Slightly things have been a little bit changed since then. So anyway, so talking about building work, so what kind of details did you end up having in Auschwitz, really, at the end of the day? Because this is quite interesting. And how did they end up doing this? So there was a work detail, a special work detail that was run by Otto Kuzel, who was prisoner number 2. He was the capo. I call him the angel of Auschwitz. I think he's absolutely incredible. So far, not one of us historians have been able to find something negative said about this man. He was, I believe, a man who saved a lot of people. But he ran the labour detail. He could reassign you to where you needed to be people would say, oh, we need X amount of prisoners to work in this commando or work detail or that commando, and then he would reassign them. He's actually very clever because he would try and reassign people that he knew were struggling or were on the brink of death, and he saved quite a lot of people by reassigning them into different work details. He's an absolutely incredible person. Otto Kuzel, again, if anybody wants to look him up. So what kind of work details? So transporting building materials. This is probably one of the hardest ones you could have. You would basically unload from the trains at a run, and I'm talking about such heavy things, from cement to bricks to concrete. All of this was literally being transported to Auschwitz, and you didn't survive long in this work detail. It was absolutely horrific. And what I'm going to explain to you in all of this is the beginnings of how Auschwitz is self-sufficient. This is where Auschwitz is now building up these blocks of what I was literally just talking about, what I was literally just showing you. You have the, I can't do German. Please do not laugh at my German. It is absolutely horrific. I can do Polish and say weird Polish words, but German I can't. So I'm going to attempt and say Holzow. If I say it wrong, I apologize. That's the lumberyard. The lumberyard, unfortunately, is where the Muslimen were sent. And the Muslimen were people, I'm going to say people because women ended up as Muslimen too, that were literally on the brink of death. They had either given up psychologically or physically and were literally on the brink of starvation and at the end of it. So they were sent there and pretty much finished off. These people were finished off very, very quickly. They were murdered by the SS and the Capo. You have, I'm not even going to attempt this one. So this is the demolition detail. So what's very interesting about this is a lot of the civilian population were expelled in 1940, 41, 42 in the local areas. So the commandos were set up to take apart buildings, to take apart homes, to take apart, which is what happened a lot in Birkenau, so Brzezinka. And this is also another quite dangerous commando because a lot of accidents would happen. You could end up getting buried under a wall. You know, you could accidentally trip and fall and break your leg, which has happened to countless prisoners. And once you'd ended up breaking a leg or damaging yourself, that's a death sentence. They didn't have anything in the hospital to be able to help you, nothing. You've got the metal workshop. I mean, they created their own metal workshop. So the Arbeit, macht, frei at the top of the gate, original gate, that was created in a metal workshop. They had a smithy and then eventually an iron cast workshop. I mean, this is literally a city within a city of being self-sufficient for themselves. You have carpentry. They built the windows. They built various things for the SS. They built I don't know, chairs and tables and work things that you needed. Everything and anything was built in the carpentry. You had your electrical detail. They are the guys that went and put in all the electrics. They did all the fences. They electrified all the fences that went around the camp. Then you'd have roofers. I mean, these guys are all, this is completely self-sufficient. Roofers that would build your roofs. You had your painting workshop. They would paint the insides. They would also paint all the signs that you needed. And one of them actually was from the first transport, and he was it's very interesting, he was an artist, and he'd actually paint small drawings of the SS men and just hand them out as gifts, where he'd be able to get a little bit of extra bread and things, just a way to survive really at the end of the day. A service sector, I use this very loosely. Service sector. I don't literally mean it as we're going to be waiting around on you on hand and foot. There's quite a few. So we've got a tannery. They had their own tannery, and the tannery was run by a capo called Erik Gronke, who was a sadist within himself. He was the pet of Rudolf Höss, and he'd he'd provide him with various different leather goods, illegal leather goods, because they weren't allowed to illegally do things. He actually got released. He didn't get tried till the second Auschwitz trials in the 60s. He liked to drown prisoners in the tanning chemicals because he could, and he'd severely beat the prisoners as well. He's not a very nice man. Also in the tannery, they would mend clothing for prisoners, also for SS men. They also made custom furniture. So if you wanted, I don't know, some custom made table of some sort, they'd make that for you. So we had, some of these are quite self-explanatory. So you could work in the food warehouse, you could work in the SS warehouse, where they had things like that the SS men needed, like mattresses and bedding and other things, that their uniforms. They also had a parcel. We're going to come back to this actually later on in this. They had a parcel office, which non-Jewish and non-Soviet prisoners of war could receive parcels from home. Very restrictive. I'd like to say it's as easy as it sounds. It's not. They were very restrictive. You couldn't have things that you had to cook, and they'd get raided by the capo quite a lot. So you'd end up with some sort of food source, but at the end of the day, it still wasn't enough of what they needed. They had their own printing press. They printed all the documents that they needed in their printing press. They had a fire department. Yeah, we're going to go down this list very quick. So that started in 1942. They did all their inspections. They installed hydrants and air raid shelters and things like that. And if you walk past, especially in Birkenau, you notice this. I was walking through Birkenau myself, and I heard these two little children screaming and going, "Oh my God, look, they had an ice ring." It wasn't an ice ring. It's kind of like a pit where they held water for the fire department. God knows who allowed their children to run around screaming in Birkenau. Please don't do that, just as an underlining thing. And no, they were not ice skating rings. It's where the water was. You had the transport department. They basically serviced all the vehicles. They serviced all the SS cars. They had horses, and they also serviced vehicles that would be pulled by prisoners. So they were pretty much treated as horses themselves as well. Effektenkammer, so that is where prisoners that were registered, they'd have all their belongings put aside, because, you know, some got released. At least 70 got released from the first transport anyway. It wasn't a very common occurrence, but it did happen. A lot of it was raided. So jewelry and things like that, people never got their full effects back either. From Effektenkammer, you've got the camp orchestra. So it was a second job on top. So for example, you could work in the Effektkammer commando, and then you'd have to be in the camp orchestra, where you'd play as prisoners would leave for work, and then you would play as prisoners would come back, sometimes hosting for the SS as well. That's another one that they were made to do. But the camp orchestra was a pretty safe bet. And if you worked in the camp orchestra, 9 times out of 10, you also had a pretty safe, I say safe very loosely, safe job. Canada, many of you probably know about Canada. It's where the sorting was for the plundered Jewish clothing and belongings. And there were two Canadas. There was one in Auschwitz 1 and one in Birkenau. The one obviously in Birkenau is 10 times bigger, and predominantly women worked in Canada. Also a job where you could find some sort of food to be able to sustain yourself, and you could smuggle in better clothing for the winter. And then the camp kitchen. So you had the SS kitchen and the camp kitchen. So there were two different. There was a escape by a couple of members of the first transport from the SS camp kitchen, where they literally just kind of locked the doors and left. It's quite interesting. So theoretically, in the service sector comes the Sonderkommando, which I'm just going to briefly touch on, which is the basically the Jews, because they were predominantly Jews, who ended up getting rid of and burning the corpses and having to utilize the corpses of those that were gassed. I'm just going to run through what the process looked like, so it will give us a better idea of the process. I tried to get the two photographs because this is a huge model in Auschwitz. It's very difficult to get it. So on the left hand side, because also what I just wanted to add is the Sonderkommando also did perform a service, even though it was one of the most horrific and psychologically damaging services, because we're going to talk about the plundering of the belongings and the utilization of the corpses in just a moment, because again, that was a business in itself. So people were the condemned who would go down into this underground chamber here on the left hand side, where they would undress. Then they would be forced into the gas chamber here. The Zyklon B would be dropped in took about 20 to 30 minutes for people to die. The hotter the weather, the better, because the gas would react much faster. The colder, the longer. And then the Sonderkommando would remove people from the gas chamber. They had a little lift. I don't know why I'm pointing. You can't see what I'm pointing. But you had a little lift here that the bodies would be taken up. You would have gold teeth removed. Hair was shaved after the gassing process in Auschwitz. It's the only camp that did that. Most of the camps did it before the gassing process. This is after the gassing process. And then bodies would be removed and put into the crematoria. And we're going to talk about what happened to the ashes in just a moment. So this process is incredibly horrific. By 1944, you have 900 members of the Sonderkommando. 900 people are taking part in this process. They're being forced to take part in this process, and most of them know that, and most of them write in their testimonies and memoirs, we were dead men walking at the end of the day. So hair.
And just to check if I'm sure, was it with the Sonderkommandos that after a certain time they were like renewed? Most working partners.
Yes and no, because it's a myth. It's a bit of a myth that they were constantly recycled. There's people that were literally one of the first Sonderkommando, Jewish Sonderkommandos in 1942 that survived up until 1945. So not all of them, they weren't constantly liquidated every, I don't know, 3, 6, 10 months. You know, a lot of them were kept because it's easier in theory. And this is another thing, talking about the gassing processes, that they tried to get over problems that they had. And one of the problems was that they kept having to get all these new people in to do the Sonderkommando's job. And these people didn't know what to do. So having to constantly replace and retrain people is just insufficient. It just doesn't work. So having the same people over and over and over, who then become desensitized to this job, because they do eventually, is easier to have them rather than just constantly getting rid of them. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, they did. And after the in October 1944, when they did the uprising, they got rid of the Sonderkommando that did that. But in general, we're talking about in general.
How horrific how the, let's say, laws of economic work around this part of the slave labor as well. It's
I mean, this is part of the slave labor. This continues. Yeah. So once the hair was shaved, they used it. They used it for a lot of things. So how much it fetched? Half a Reichsmark per kilo. I mean, they're making money on dead women's hair at this stage. Half a Reichsmark per kilo. You've got the process. So how did this process look of them gassing the people to shaving their hair? So they'd shave the hair off. They would take them up into the kind of the roof spaces in the crematoria, and they'd hang the hair for it to dry. They'd comb it out, and then they'd dry it. They'd pack it into these sort of paper sort of packages and send it off into the Reich. And it's very interesting because sometimes you would find hairpins when they were sent on to different factories and things like that. It was noted that people found hairpins and realized that this is actually real human hair. After liberation, they find 7,000 kilos ready to ship. Okay, so if we're looking at one woman approximately has between 40 to 50 grams of hair, give or take. Okay, we're looking at, in that one section of where they found this hair ready to go, 140,000 people. 140,000 people in 7,000 kilograms. And you can see the hair, some of it's been preserved and sent to and kept in the Auschwitz Museum. So who actually purchased this hair? So the Teppich Fabric, which is after the war, the Silesian plush and rug factory, they managed to test some of this rug and materials. They sent it off to in Krakow into the Jagiellonian University, and they found traces of prussic acid, which is a component of Zyklon B. So we can confirm 100% that they were recycling this hair, and that was being completely and utterly utilized. And it wasn't just used for cloth and things like that. They were used for socks and hoses for submarine and railway workers. So it wasn't just used for one thing. It actually ended up going into even Austria. The process of this going into so many different places was just incredible. And they were still selling it at half a Reichsmark per kilo. So they're utilizing everything. So what else? Sorry, I've already spoken about that. So here's some of the hair. You can't actually take photographs in Auschwitz, so I had to steal this from the Auschwitz website because it's carefully preserved, all of the hair that's on display and the hair that they do have. So what are the uses that they have for the corpses? So the ashes and the bones were specially crushed. So once they were coming out of the crematoria, if there were bits of bone, sometimes hip bones, for example, were very difficult to cremate, they would have this special kind of tubular thing, and they'd literally crush the bones down to a fine powder. They would throw the bones and the ashes into the river Sowa and into the river Wisła to specially dug pits and into the ponds. But the one thing that it was also really interesting of what they used it for, and this is what most people don't realize when they walk the streets and walk the roads of Auschwitz, they were used to build the roads. They were used as fertilizer. They were used as insulating material. So these ashes are literally being spread far and wide. And they're also being used, as I said, for fertilizer. They're being sold to other companies to use as fertilizer. So we're literally using every single part of the body to get rid of it. And I'm going to tell a story that's not quite a nice story. So the Hygiene Institute in the Reichskorps would basically buy meat and boil it and use it for, God, I forgot what the word is, bacteriological sort of experimental things. And what the SS men would do is they would steal this meat, the pork and the beef, and they would replace it with human flesh. So what happened next gets even worse, because the prisoners who worked in the Hygiene Institute in the Reichskorps would steal the meat and eat it. And late 43, early 44, they actually found out the real truth, that they were eating human flesh. I'm not saying gas victims, we're talking about people that were shot in the crematoria and things like that. So it's quite disgusting at this point. So let's move on to being more self-sufficient. So we have farming. For 6 new farms end up being created. So here we've got Auschwitz 1. Here we have Birkenau, and Brzezinka is the village, obviously, where Birkenau was built. Then you have one in Babice, Puławy, Harmęże, Rajsko, and Budy as well. So you've got all of these farms are now being created, and subcamps are going to these. At the beginning, obviously, there weren't subcamps. You had to walk. So if you were based in Brzezinka, you would have to walk to Rajsko, or you'd have to walk to Budy. It's far. It's a far walk. So it's not always convenient, which is why a lot of these subcamps end up being created. So all of these villages here, there's no people. These people have all been expelled. So all the farming equipment, all the livestock, everything has now been confiscated and is now being utilized by the SS. So we're talking about 4,000 hectares in space here that they've utilized. So in the Reichskorps, whoops, sorry, well, I've gone the wrong way, apologies. So in the Reichskorps down here, you've got the vegetable patches and things like that. They also did a special rubber experiments where women ended up coming that were chemical engineers, and things that took part in these experiments here. You have Harmerge, which was a poultry farm. They also had fish ponds, and it was created in spring 1941. You had about 2,000 chickens, and the chickens would obviously hatch more chickens. So they just kept creating. They had geese and turkeys and about 3,000 rabbits. So they had rabbit hutches here as well. So Budy, Babica, Brzezinka, so these four here, they were basically growing grain, potatoes, beets, cabbage, hay. They had pigs and horses and rabbits and sheep and everything. So they were literally self-sufficient. They were creating their own food sources. They were creating their own meat sources. And if you weren't working on the fields in the end of the day, you would work on the drainage systems and building roads. So working outside was probably one of the worst jobs you could end up doing in all weathers. It rained, it was, I don't know, freezing cold, you still worked outside at the end of the day. So at this point, we have our farming. We're already seeing more self-sufficientness at this point. Sorry, apologies. And what was the difference between all of these? Actually, Rajsko is probably the best one to work in, because when you were somebody who actually had something to offer, so all your chemical engineers, all your scientists and things like that, they actually had a chance to take care of your hygiene better, and you had the opportunity to change your clothes more often and to work in slightly better conditions. The worst one to work in were the fish ponds, because you had to clean out your fish ponds, and being in water all day and being dirty and not being able to wash yourself or clean yourself is not one of the best options or something that you would want to do. Prisoners would end up being drowned left, right and centre by the Kapo in the SS. It was quite a dangerous job. So industrial work. So
basically you might say these are all kind of jobs focused at gaining self-sufficient, self-supporting, Auschwitz as a cluster of camps.
Yes. So now we're going to delve into something different. So we've looked at self-sufficiency. Auschwitz is now self-sufficient. We're now going to go to the external works. I'm going to try, I'm time conscious at the moment. So we're looking at industrial work. Now, the first industries that come into the Auschwitz sphere, let's say the sphere, and it's the priority is given to SS firms. So, you know, your friend who works for the SS obviously gets that better up, gets to make money for their firm. It's also a political decision. You help me, I help you, sort of thing. The second to largest employer is what we're looking at right now, and that's the cement factories in Goleshov. The subcamps created in July 1942. And by 1944, you've got over 1,000 prisoners working in the cement factory. The prisoners basically produced, packed, shipped, and the discipline in this subcamp was just not that I'm saying any were better or worse, but this was one of the worst. Goleshov is south of Auschwitz, going towards the mountains, so it's a bit far out. But this is one of the first ones. So this was an SS-owned factory. Yeah. So when does private industry come into this? And IG Farben, which is what everybody probably wants me to talk about, IG Farben is the first private industry that comes into playing into this mix. So IG Farben is a chemical factory. They are looking at this stage for natural resources, and in the area of Oświęcim, or Auschwitz in German, is very rich in coal. So you have already one source that you need for making synthetic rubber, and that is coal. And this is where all the coal mines come into play and everything else. So the barriers are finally lifted for these private institutions and state monopoly industries, and it's lifted. It's lifted in 42, 41, 42. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember that date 100%. And these guys at IG Farben is supported by the state. And as I said, they're looking for raw materials, which is exactly what Auschwitz has. They at this point are having problems because they are at risk of being bombed by the Allies. So what better place to move to than Oświęcim, which is so far away from the Allies? They're not going to bother making that whole trip out there just to bomb the factories in IG Farben at that distance. So that is one of the reasons why they move specifically to Auschwitz. They finally make the decision in 1941. There's photos later on of when Himmler visits the building of this factory. And obviously the concentration camp has cheap labor. It's perfect. It's a perfect thing because they don't have to pay full-time civilian workers more money. So it's cost effective. Himmler inspects the area in March 1941. And that's when he mentions about the increase in the camp, which is the first thing that I mentioned, to 30,000. And he wants to allocate 10,000 prisoners to IG Farben. This doesn't happen, by the way. It's not a realistic attempt of a number to send to IG Farben at this point. In April 1941, the Polish prisoners, because at this point they're only Polish prisoners in April 1941, remember the Czechs arrive in June 1941. So the Polish prisoners are sent to build IG Farben. In October 1942, that is when Monowitz or Auschwitz III is created. Why is it created at this specific time? Well, in that summer, there was a massive typhus outbreak in Auschwitz and Birkenau. It was so huge that prisoners were just dying left, right, and center. And it was a problem because prisoners couldn't come to work to build the IG Farben factory. So they're becoming very, very frustrated. So they create their own subcamp where prisoners have to undergo quarantine. Anybody found with typhus is sent back to the main camp. So they create their first barracks, and the prisoners now work in Monowitz or Auschwitz III, the IG Farben factory. The construction was slow, but slowly becomes better and faster. They didn't hit the quota of 10,000. So instead they sent about 3,800 by the end of 42. We're not hitting these quotas at all. So IG Farben is not happy at this stage. And these problems are continuing into 43. And then in February 1943, it falls from 3,800 to 1,500. I mean, we're dropping. We're severely dropping now in this. We're going to get to conditions in a moment. And then in the first half of 43, the promise of the Berlin Jews to be sent. However, 14,620 arrive, and only 37% are registered. The rest are gassed. They're needing healthy people at the moment. They're being sent old people, children, basically people that are useless to them. They need healthy people to be able to work in their factory, building, constructing, and literally working on the inside the factory. Only in 1944 do they hit 11,000. So it takes them a while to actually hit that. So coal mines, I mentioned that earlier, they're looking for raw materials, so coal mines. So coal is a raw ingredient for the production of synthetic rubber. IG Farben starts inquiring actually in 1940 to try and acquire some of these local coal mines. Here we've got another, I forgot, I should have gone through these photos. So this is one of prisoners unloading cement for IG Farben. Here we go. So here Hitler visits, you can see the factory being built behind. So this is Hitler's second visit, and the IG Farben complex here of how it looked like with all the barracks, and finally 11,000 prisoners by 1944. So coal mines. So on the left hand side is why has my mind gone blank? It's the Fursten mine. Then you have I'm going to say, I can't say it in the German way. It's Jawiszowice in Polish. So I apologize. I'm going to go down the Polish road because it's easier for me. So the mine on the left-hand side is the first one that's acquired. IG Farben gain 51% of the shares in February 1941. And the first prisoners are sent then in September 43. So it's kind of a bit of a long gap between prisoners, them acquiring the mine or taking major control of the shares, to prisoners actually being sent there. And then another 2 mines are acquired by IG Farben, Janina in Libyange, and the Piast mine. Jawiszowice is acquired by, I'll tell you by who in a moment, we'll get to that in that stage. The conditions working in the coal mines, you can already see how horrific the conditions were working in the coal mine. Death rate was high, survival rate was low, all sorts of prisoners were sent. Predominantly Jews worked in the coal mines, but there were also Poles, Germans, Soviet prisoners of war that also worked there. Conditions were, like I mentioned, I don't know how people managed to survive in these coal mines. They also end up taking over more coal mines. So Brzeszcze, which is Jawiszowice, is literally 10-minute drive from Auschwitz. You can see the what are they called?
The cranes, the wheels from the elevators.
Yeah, you can see them actually from Auschwitz. And it is acquired by, and I'm going to read this, it's the Reichswerke, ready? Hermann Goering. So who acquires, or whose company acquires these coal mines?
Goering, I mean, head of the Air Force, Luftwaffe.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. They have all their fingers and all their pies, making a boatload of money. So Goering's company has now acquired mines. They also have other sub-camps that do other things. I mean, we don't have all day. We could go through every single sub-camp at this rate. So this opens in mid-August, and 150 French Jews are sent to work in the camp. Again, by 44, you've got 2,500 people working in this specific coal mine, Jawiszowice here on the right-hand side. The one good thing about working here, apart from obviously the conditions and the horrific treatment of the prisoners, was that you got to change your clothing. So your hygiene was good, because you would wear one set of clothing when you were down in the mine, you'd come up, have a shower, and change and have a new set of clothing. That's where the lice outbreaks were very low in these camps. I'd like to say there's a bright side of everything, but obviously not in this situation. But that is probably the only positive about this sub-camp going this way. It was exhausting. And the worst thing is there were selections every few weeks. There were selections more often in the coal mining sub-camps than anywhere. Anybody who was useless, sick, was sent to Auschwitz.
And given that this was this kind of hard labor, as in very fatiguing, were the rations increased by any means compared to the prisoners in, let's say, as the service jobs in Auschwitz, or were the rations exactly the same?
The Russians were treated exactly the same. Everybody was treated the same. At the end, the Jews were treated harsher, much harsher, obviously, because they were Jewish. But at the end of the day, the terror ran rampant for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a Pole, a Jew, or a Russian prisoner of war, a Czech, a French political prisoner. If you looked at someone in the wrong way, that could cost you your life.
Yeah. So given that the rations were not enough to survive on, let's say, with easy jobs, here you would have no chance of survival at all, basically.
So you had no chance of survival anywhere. Oh. 9 times out of 10. There are jobs where you had, but we'll talk about survival in a bit. You can ask me that question at the end, because that's something I really like to concentrate on. How did people manage to survive these situations? Like, how did you do it? But anyway, let's jump through. So we've got power plants. I'm going to jump through some of these quite quickly. So you've got power plants in heavy industry. You have on the left hand side Gliwice or Gliwice 1. There were 3 subcamps in Gliwice. They were repairing freight trains, carts, building roads, and you had about 1,336 prisoners that worked in that subcamp. And on the right-hand side, it's a name you should all be familiar with, and that is Siemens. That was the Siemens company on the right-hand side. In late 43, they decided to also invest in a factory in the area. So we've got to remember, over 40 subcamps. We still haven't found them all. There are still more to find, okay, through research, but over 40 subcamps are now. So life in the Siemens factory was better than most because they required specific engineers and people that knew what they were doing. So they weren't beaten as severely as other people. So life was a little bit better in the Siemens factory. What other sort of things have we got? Well, living and working conditions. This is Birkenau. So living conditions didn't really vary much. So they all lived predominantly, I'm going to use this as a general term because obviously some sub-camps were different, predominantly lived in wooden barracks with the tiers. They were overcrowded, and the conditions were no different to Birkenau or Auschwitz, even though Auschwitz I had slightly better living conditions, but in general there was no difference. There's no difference in either one of them. They had lack of clothing, lack of food. The food was controlled by the main camp. So they pretty much, we're going to touch on that in a minute. I've got a table on the other side that will show you exactly the difference of how much prisoners were receiving every day. Some received extra supplements, and we'll see that in the table. And then in the final stage of war, things change because you've got less labor. So you kind of need to take care of your workers a little bit better instead of them mass dying out. You know, if you want to be creating ammunition, then, and you've got no people, but you're also killing them off, it kind of makes no logical sense. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So the camp authorities ended up intervening with these factories about the conditions and how people were being treated. We're talking about like right at the final stage of war. They have regular selections, as I mentioned earlier. Obviously, the coal mines had it worse. They were taken to Birkenau, most likely gassed. And it was sometimes written in the contract of some of these companies where if your prisoners were sick, they would be removed and replaced by fresh prisoners. Let's use that word, by fresh, new prisoners. There was severe discipline. There were things like standing cells, floggings, hangings. People who decided to escape were executed. It pretty much ran just like the other two main camps. And it just mimicked, it just sometimes depended on your commandant. Some of them were harsher than others. Some of them were better than others. It just depended on the type of job that you ended up hitting or getting. Prisoners would end up committing suicide. So, for example, jumping down the mine shaft was a regular occurrence, throwing themselves under wagons, and they just couldn't take the long working days and the physicalness and the psychological damage. Sometimes they would end up tearing their own teeth out, their own gold teeth out, to try and trade for food. To try and survive. I mean, imagine trying to pull your own tooth out. I scream myself when I'm in the dentist. When he touches me, I don't know what it would be like if I just had to pull my tooth out to survive. It's absolutely unbelievable. The mining camps also were treated like a penal style company as well. So if you did misbehaved or did something out that you shouldn't have, which could be anything, looked wrong at a capo, they could send you to the mines for penal punishment. Again, survival rate was quite low in a lot of these mines. So how does this affect productivity? Well, we'll start with the food, because as you can see, you've got three statistics. So you've got 40 to 42, 42 to 44, and 44 to 45. So you can see that the meat and the products of the meat goes down over time. Again, fats go down. We're looking at calories of between 1,300 calories to 17. Now, if you're doing this back-breaking labor, you need at least 3,000 calories in your system. You need to be eating a lot to be able to sustain yourself. These people are not eating enough. Your bread goes down, goes slightly up at the end. Your sugar stays the same. Marmalade, the buckwheats and groats go slightly higher, and your flour products go down. They're losing out on nutrition, not that it was nutritious at all, and calories at this stage. It says for prisoners to get, for example, 400 grams of meat and 200 grams of fat and 2,740 grams of bread. Wasn't always in reality. Sometimes they got it, sometimes they didn't. They were lucky if they did manage to get what is actually written on the sheet. Prisoners were also given supplements for those doing hard labor. At the beginning, in the early days, when prisoners were being, for example, mass shot in executions and things, prisoners who would take care of the burying the dead, they'd get an extra loaf of bread or some extra soup or something like that, or any sorts of jobs like that. They got a little bit extra food. But at the end of the day, if you're going to survive, you have to organize your food. So that's a bit of camp jargon on being able to gain food. So if you worked in the vegetable patch, you would smuggle food back for your friends. Or, I don't know, for example, Tadeusz Pietrzakowski, who was the Polish boxer, the film's just come out in Poland. I think it's gone worldwide. It's called The Champion, or mistrz in Polish. For example, he would get a lot of bread and sausage and extra food, and he'd go around and share it with his comrades, his friends. It's probably the only way that you're going to survive at this stage, is trying to organize your food. What else? I mean, the average civilian was quite productive, let's just say that. In reality, they expected 75% of productivity of a prisoner from Auschwitz. In reality, we're looking between 40 and 60%. So literally half an average worker. So 2 prisoners would do the one job of an actual civilian. The productivity is completely low. And why? Well, one of the reasons is here, food. They're not eating enough. They're not being able to have enough. The nutrition is low. They've got lack of sleep. So, for example, while you're waiting for food, you're waiting for hours for food, you're waiting at roll call, you're waiting to use the latrine. All that time of waiting and waiting and waiting could have been used to rest. You're not resting. For example, they tried, I've got an interesting quote, actually, I pulled this up very specifically for this. So prisoners actually tried to beat the system for having to do this hard backbreaking labor. And this is actually taken from my MA dissertation, and it clicked in my mind. I thought this would actually be perfect for this moment. So Bronisław Kościński, from the first transport, one of the first jobs he ever got was creating this little garden in Auschwitz I. And I'm gonna read this out. So he says, "I said that I was a gardener. A capo took me and gave me a spade and a rake, and my task was to make a flower bed in front of block 3 and a hook where flowers were to be hung. I went to work, and in 2 hours the bed was done. The capo came, took a look, and screamed at me. At the beginning, I didn't understand what his problem was. What he meant was that the job was to take 3 days and not 2 hours. He destroyed the whole flower bed and ordered me to start again. From this moment onwards, I began to respect my work." So the point is, they're trying to beat the system at this stage. So, for example, carrying a box of dirt from one end to another, you know, or buckets of half filled water, or in this case, taking 3 days to put a flower bed together that should realistically take you 2 hours. He learns this and actually passes it on to other prisoners. So he ends up working in one of the fields, and he says here, "The section I was marked out for us to complete would, with hard work, completed in 2 to 3 hours. We were given a whole day. I told my helpers that we can't be idle for even a moment." So at this point, they're still pretending and looking like they're actually doing something. This job needed to last us to the evening. So you had to do nothing but just move. Till the job was completed, no one checked up on us, not the capo nor the escorting SS men. As the expert, I, along with my friends, received extra soup in the camp, and this counted for a lot. So this is quite an interesting, you see this a lot in testimonies, where this is another reason how prisoners manage to survive in such hard, you know, situations, being able to pretend that they're having to do so much work. Working days, I don't know if I've got my next, here we go. We've got a working day. I'm just time conscious. I am near the end, I do promise. We have a working day. So I actually had to double check this in the in one of my books, because I wasn't quite 100% sure how, because every day obviously changes over time, and I think that it changes even more, but I didn't manage to put it in. But at the beginning, in summer 1940, so you worked between 6 and 7 with an hour break. In the winter, it was 2 hours less. In 41, you had a long gap in between the middle of the day. Then it changes again to 6 to 5 with 30 minutes. And then probably the worst is in 43, where 6:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. and the only time that you had off was when you were eating. So you're just absolutely exhausted all the time, and you just don't have that time. I mean, factories were different. They would have 1 to 2 to 3 different shifts. You could work between 8 to 12 hours, depending on the factory. So, for example, IG Farben could force you to work 12-hour shifts or 13-hour shifts or even 14-hour shifts, or you were forced to work till you finished the quota for the day. The worst thing was about IG Farben is at the beginning, before there was an actual subcamp in Monowitz or Auschwitz III, prisoners would have to get up at 4 a.m. in the morning, walk to Monowitz, work all day, and by the time they returned past 9 o'clock, and lights out was at 9 o'clock at this stage. So they'd been gone for so many hours and just were totally and utterly exhausted. This is some of the working conditions that they ended up having to go through. And in Gliwice, they would work 12-hour shifts. They were horrific 12-hour shifts in Gliwice or Gliwice 1. So profits. Okay, there've got to be some sort of profits at this stage. I have statistics. I had to write these statistics down only because I don't remember, so bear with me. So obviously they make significant profit. Okay, you're going to make profit. You've got cheap labor at the end of the day. So the private companies end up paying a lot more than obviously the SS-run companies. You know, you're going to help your friends out at this rate. So at the beginning, it was... So for a skilled worker, it was 1.5 Reichsmarks. For an unskilled worker, it was half a Reichsmark. Oh, and women, by the way, were unskilled workers because they were clearly useless. Women are totally useless in this. By the way, women are classed as unskilled workers because clearly women can't be skilled workers at all. Please note the sarcasm in my voice.
Duly noted. Duly noted.
Okay, because you know, obviously, all for women's rights.
I'm with you on this point. I have 2 girls, so.
Sorry, women can't be historians either. Apologies. No, I'm joking. So then in summer 43, this changes, and obviously, it's between 3 to 4 for skilled and 1.5 to 3 for unskilled and women. The private sector. So let's compare this. So the private sector has to pay between 4 to 6 Reichsmarks for a skilled, when it was originally 1.5 Reichsmarks for a skilled. I mean, do you see the difference here? It's a big difference. And for unskilled was 3 to 4 compared to half a Reichsmark. I mean, that is an incredible sizable difference. And they were worth pretty much 50% of a German worker. German workers were far more important at this stage. So my point is, I'm going to wrap this up now, because my point is, I mean, Auschwitz was self-sufficient for a very long time in itself, and it outsourced its labor force. Out of 1.3 million people that end up being sent there, only 400,000 of these people are registered. So, and even half of those people were actually sent out into the workforce. A lot of them were women, and women are clearly useless. They can't carry cement. They can't build roads. I mean, they were forced to, but they're clearly useless. They're not as useful as men. Men had a higher chance of having a job than a woman in the camp system. And at the end of the day, it was these people. So I posted the liberation photo of the children that were liberated from Auschwitz. And I think it's quite a poignant moment to stop at. So thank you. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah. One question was posed during your presentation. It was done by Dagmar. I'll read it out. You told about the Germans replacing the pork and the beef with human flesh meat.
Yeah.
The question was, why did the Germans replace it with human meat?
Oh, because they could have it. They stole it for themselves. You know, why are we going to send this amazing pork and beef to just be made into stuff that, you know, that it's a waste? So they're going to steal it, and they used it and ate it for themselves and just replaced it with the human flesh. I think, first of all, that's just really disgusting, and second of all, I cannot imagine being the person finding out that I have just been eating human flesh. It's absolutely horrific.
Indeed. Okay, so that was one question which came along during the presentation. Any other questions from those still listening in?
I know you had a question.
Yeah, well, we kind of briefly touched it during the presentation. If there were like working partners that were favored among the prisoners because they had a higher rate of chance of survival. You already discussed it a little bit, but maybe you can enhance a little bit about it.
I can, because it basically sums up the question of how did you survive?
Yeah.
Right. How did you survive this system?
Organizing food, I understood.
Organizing food is one of them. One of the others, the one that actually pretty much every prisoner says, I was lucky. It was pure luck. It was pure luck that the guy behind me looked at the capo wrong, or the capo singled out the guy behind me and decided to beat him and kill him. You know, a lot of it stems on luck, according to them. But at the beginning, the first prisoners end up with the best jobs. Okay, why do they end up with the best jobs? Because they get the jobs under a roof. If you have a job under a roof, okay, it's not going to guarantee your survival. Nothing is going to guarantee your survival, but it's going to give you a better chance of survival. Because in the winter, it's cold, it's freezing, you're inside, you have, sometimes you ended up having food. So prisoners that worked in the kitchen had access to food. They could smuggle and feed themselves. Or for example, if you worked in the stables, you could, however disgusting it was, you know, eat some of the feed, which was, you know, food for them at the end of the day. Also knowing the camp was important. Once you knew your camp, then you knew where to hide, for example, if someone was looking for you, or where the guard towers were if you needed to sneak out to the hospital, or for example, helping out a friend. That's another really important thing. The prisoner community was so tight-knit, especially at the beginning, especially in those first few initial months, where prisoners were literally helping each other. So if somebody had extra bread, they would share it, or for example, helping hide a prisoner in a hospital, or information about execution, anything along those lines. Prisoner solidarity was incredible. Okay. And also knowing which capo and which SS men to avoid is really important. So for example, avoiding Bruno Brodniewicz, prisoner number 1, as much as possible. Or if you're struggling, you go to Otto Kuzel, prisoner number 2, who would literally give you the shirt off his back. And it has been noted many times where he'd literally take the shirt off his back and give it to a prisoner in need.
Yeah. You already mentioned him in the beginning of the presentation. I have one question here again from Dagmar. The name Otto Kuzel, but the surname especially. Can you write it out or spell it out? So
yep. So it's K with the U with the dots.
Yeah.
S-E-L-L.
Okay, Kuzel.
He is incredible.
Thank you on behalf of Dagmar. I see your face brightening up. So
he's incredible. At the moment, I'm trying to lobby for him to get some
recognition.
Yeah, from Poland, because I think he saved so many more people. My former supervisor has some very interesting documents on him that he will share once he publishes his new book. With me, but it's all on the secret. But he's told me about them, but I can't really use them until I see them and work with them myself. So it's really exciting. And I think both of us have this weird obsession with Otto Kuzel because he is just so incredible. I could probably do a whole presentation on him himself. He's just...
Well, I have more topics that you only touched upon where I think I want to know more, but for today it's just touching the surface. So maybe.
Oh my god! Do you know what? Trying to do this is like it's a spider web where I sat down.
Killing your darlings, probably.
Well, yeah, I sat down. I was thinking, oh my god, where do I go with this talk? Because talking about labor is so wide, and we've literally touched the tip of the iceberg.
I know.
There is so much more to go into this. I mean, we could, like you said, we could do one subcamp for 2 hours. We could, it's so much information out there that we could utilize and talk about. So I try to give this overview of how it all worked. And if
I'm quite aware of the challenge I put in front of you. My excuses, but thanks so far.
Any more questions?
Yeah, any more questions? Derek poses the question: what happened with the factories after liberation of the camp? Does they still exist?
Monowita does. Monowita does. They do exist. Some of them were taken apart. Some of them were taken over. You can go and see Monowita. It's a private property at the moment. But obviously the subcamp itself doesn't exist, but the factory still does. But you can if you're in Auschwitz, I would highly recommend people to hire their own car and drive to Auschwitz to be able to go and see it, because then you can go and move around. You can do your own research, contact me if you like. And there are still remnants of these camps and walls and parts of barracks. Jawiszowice, for example, there's a barrack still standing in the middle of a park. That you can go and see. So there are still these remnants that you can go and explore yourself.
Yeah, and in one of the subcamps, the one with the fish ponds, there's this exhibition from one of the prisoners, the artist who did this very graphic drawings of his memory of Auschwitz. I can't come to his name.
So in Hardemelja, it's not Jan Komsky. Oh my God, my brain has gone. Sorry, my brain has gone into mush.
It's been a long day. It's been a long presentation.
It's too many prisoners. Funnily enough, I actually have him here. So in my notes somewhere, Marian Kowodziej, that was it. Marian Kowodziej. Yeah. So he's in the basement. His ashes are also interned in the basement of the church in Hardemelja. I would highly recommend people going to see. Not many people know that it exists there. They're quite harrowing. He has done incredible drawings that unfortunately are not allowed to be published.
There was an exhibition in the Netherlands, I think by now 2 or 3 years ago. We did some images on the website, so maybe people can look it up, or otherwise I will send an email afterwards. But they are quite graphic, let's put it that way.
They some of them do get worse, and they're the unpublished version. Unfortunately, you'd have to specifically go into Auschwitz to be able to see them, but they're not allowed to be published. He put a marker or something on them to not allow them to be published, which is a shame, because it shows life in Auschwitz in an interesting way.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of painters in Auschwitz that painted to kind of deal with the PTSD at the end. I mean, Kowodziej actually didn't start painting till later in his life after he had a stroke, and not many people knew that he was in a concentration camp. No. So it was quite news to them that he ended up paralyzed actually, and he ended up painting in a very creative way. So have a look at him, Marian Kowodziej, very interesting gentleman.
And another topic altogether. So let me look if there are any other questions. Few people have the cameras on, so I can see people nodding yes or no, but there are no questions anymore in the chat. Like you already said, it's like we haven't even scratched the surface. Yes, it's the tip of the iceberg, or whatever expression you want to use. On behalf of the listeners, speaking for myself, I cannot speak for the others. I find it a very interesting introduction. If I can kind of sum it up, you quite clearly made it that the forced labor basically started out as making the camp self-sufficient. And once that was running, I made the title of this presentation before I kind of brought it back to slave labor. I said the exploitation of humans. You made it quite graphic with the exploitation of the corpses from the people that were gassed. I think that was everything is horrific, but that was the most horrific part to me. Even though you know the stories, if you come across it, it gives me goosebumps. And the final part on the private industry and, let's say, the economics of the forced labor, that it was run as an economy. It's stunning. I mean, mind-boggling. But thank you so much. If there, let's say, if I have any other topics I want to exploit with you, I will surely get in touch, because it was quite well prepared, very knowledgeable. So on behalf of the others, I say thank you very much. I will give you a small thank you gift later on. I can't do it digitally, but a book is coming your way on Polish history, on the World War II, from a Dutch journalist, which is translated into Polish, just recently released. That's coming your way. Thank you once more, and to the other participants, thanks for taking part. Thanks for watching. I will end the live stream now. It's on YouTube instead of Facebook, as promised, but well, we had problems with Facebook today. People can look it back, point it out to others, and I hope to see you, Alina, or the other participants in one of our future lectures, presentations. I see a thank you very much coming into the chat. As to, if you can unshare your screen, Alina. I just shortly like to share my screen, if people don't mind, and then we finish. And that's, this was the opening slide. Let me skip to the next slide. No, I have to do that on the other screen. This presentation is part of Maand van de Geschiedenis from Polen in Beeld. We have at least one more presentation lined up. That's at the end of the month. We do this in cooperation with the Eerste Poolse Panzerdivisie in België. Dirk, welkom. Stichting Drill Polen en Oorlogsmuseum Gdynia en Axel. It will be a presentation in situ in the museum. We will do a live stream as well. Unfortunately, Alina, for you, it's in Dutch. We will record it. If you want, I can give a voiceover later on, but be welcome. If you want to know more, just scan the QR code or go to our website. Thank you once more. Thanks, everybody. Have a pleasant evening. Let's say have a reflective evening, maybe after a presentation like this. And hope to see you maybe end October or one of the other future presentations. Thanks, everybody. And for now, good night.